So I have a lot of slides here, most of which I'm going to be able to ignore, but I put lots of things up because it would allow me to address some of the issues that have been raised here already by various other speakers. So you'll be aware that Ireland is extremely FDI intensive, by which I mean in terms of manufacturing employment, for example, the share of the manufacturing workforce employed by foreign multinationals here is about twice the EU average. And that same sort of statistic applies to services. So foreign direct investment is clearly very important to the Irish economy. There's various other measures around here that will, that will confirm that point. An interesting statistic. My data differs in some respects from that put forward by Proncius earlier, but you can see there that foreign affiliates, according to my data source, account for about almost 80% of Irish exports. So most export activity, really, when you look at the aggregate, is reflecting the behaviour of multinational firms. This slide here, which I'm not going to talk very much about, though reflects the main area of research that I've been engaged in over the last year or so, which is studying the origins of Ireland's FDI strategy. And I've unearthed, this is a lot of archival work, so I've mainly presented this to historians rather than to economists or geographers. But amongst the things that I've come across, and I've published several papers on this already, one is that when the Industrial Development Authority was established in 1949, it was established outside civil service structures. Civil servants were seconded to do the work, but the board of the IDA, which consisted of 4 directors initially, were independent of the civil service. And this proved extremely important because when Sean Lemass came back into power as Minister for Industry and Commerce, he was the guy who had formulated Ireland's protectionist strategy, and the guy mainly given credit for dismantling protectionism. In fact, he issued the IDA with an explicit order to spend all their time looking at the possibilities of developing a group of 22 sectors that, and he did it in typical import substituting fashion. He looked at a bunch of things that we were importing and said, I don't see why we can't produce this here, and so on. And the IDA ignored him. By 1952, they had, in response to a report that they got from American consultants, the experience of Puerto Rico loomed large in their understanding of the way forward for Ireland. Now, it's interesting reading all the documents from this period that Ireland never hired anybody other than American consultants, who would not have dreamt, of course, of hiring British consultants. But hiring American consultants, this report from 1952 is pretty much a useless report. I read it last week in the National Library, and of 100 pages, there's 1 page on the Puerto Rican experience that points out that Puerto Rico had an unusual position with respect to the American economy. It's a US protectorate, and that it enjoyed tax-free status in terms of its exports to the US, or sorry, tariff-free status, and yet it wasn't governed by US corporation tax. And the IDA latched onto this, and for the following 4 years, in every report to government, they talked about the Puerto Rican experience and suggested this is a way forward for Ireland. Eventually, in 1956, Ireland adopted its low corporation tax regime. So that's over 50 years ago now that we've had this. Proncius mentioned this morning this adoption of the low corporation tax regime was seen as a quick fix. That's actually not correct in terms of my working through the historical archives and so on. In fact, it was the outcome of a 10-year battle between the Department of Finance and the Revenue Commissioners, who wanted no part of this scheme, and the Department of Industry and Commerce that were pushing it. And there was a set of unusual circumstances in 1956, a non-Fianna Fáil coalition government, where the Taoiseach announced that we were going to introduce this low corporation tax regime against the wishes of finance, against the wishes of his own Minister for Finance, so it was very unusual, and that was the origin of our FDI regime. So there was a lot of unusual circumstances that led to our stumbling upon the FDI strategy. So that's the work that has really excited me over the last year or so, history work, but I'm going to leave it there. Ireland's success with respect to foreign direct investment, clearly membership of the EU is important, not membership of the Eurozone, as I mentioned in an earlier contribution. And membership of the Eurozone is not particularly important to, perhaps for the IFSC, I don't know about that, but for most FDI, membership of the Eurozone is not crucial. The low corporation tax regime, though, is clearly crucial. And we're in an interesting position. Seamus raised this question earlier on. It makes us vulnerable on a lot of fronts, that we have to keep an eye on what the US authorities are doing, because half our investment or more foreign direct investment comes from the US. So changes to the US corporation tax regime can have hugely important effects on Ireland. And at the same time, ongoing developments within the European Union with respect to corporation tax can also have hugely important implications for Ireland. So we have invested a lot of our diplomatic resources in trying to counter moves within the US system for them to try and change their corporation tax rate. I've looked at newspapers from the 1960s where American politicians were talking about the possibility of changing their laws. The big issue here is the law on deferral, that if the US changed their corporation tax system, whereby multinational profits paid tax to the US upon those profits being earned rather than upon them being repatriated to the US, this would have a very dramatic impact on Ireland. President Obama, in running for the Democratic nomination last time around, made noises saying that he was thinking of changing these rules. As I say, I've seen those noises reflected all the way back to the 1960s, and they never happen. And there's good reasons why they never happen, but it's a typical thing for a Democratic politician in the US to make noises about wanting to change this. But essentially, once they get into power, and they read all the reports and everything, they realise the logic indicates that they should not change this law. But it's constantly coming up. As I say, it's been coming up for decades. The importance of the EU corporation tax regime, though, is clearly of a symmetric importance to us. A lot of the running these days is made by the European Court of Justice. All of their judgments have really been supportive of the right to free capital movements within Europe, which is beneficial to Ireland. The noise is being made at the moment by France and Germany about the possible desire to harmonise corporation tax rates. That would be the single most dramatic blow to the Irish economy, I would think, in 50 years or so, if that were to happen. Of course, it can't happen because we have a veto over it. But the governance of the EU and the Eurozone has become the issues, problems with respect to how the Eurozone is governed have become so much more obvious to us in recent times. Traditionally, Gareth Fitzgerald used to always talk about the role of the European Commission in defending smaller member states' rights within Europe. As we know from recent months, the European Commission does not run the Eurozone, it runs the EU. And these are very big issues that I'm surprised Ireland's political scientists have not been alerting us to the importance of this. The common consolidated corporate tax base, it's very difficult to make a judgment on how precisely it would affect Ireland. It would really depend on the number of multinationals that chose to sign up to it. In the background papers at the moment, make it sound as though the signing up to the common consolidated corporate tax base would be voluntary for companies and for countries. It's difficult to imagine that situation prevailing into the long term, but that's a forthcoming battle. So corporation tax rates are clearly crucial, and people who claim that they're not, you really have to think, why else is Ireland so spectacularly FDI dependent? Because those of us who work in universities know that it's not due to the extremely high quality of our educational system. We like to pat ourselves on the back, but we know it's not true. So you have to think what else is it. The other crucial factor in Ireland's ability to draw in FDI is what I'm calling here the FDI policy ecosystem. The Industrial Development Authority, now kind of segmented into IDA Ireland and FIRFOS and various other bodies, really plays a crucial role and very high up in the hierarchy, the Irish policy-making hierarchy. It draws for its influence on what some theorists call its transnational strategic network, which consists of its network of overseas offices and the very strong relationship that it maintains with foreign multinationals in Ireland. On the next slide here, I just show you the shifting geography of its overseas network, which is something I did for a different paper recently. Back in 1970, you see, I hope you can see that, yeah, you can see the IDA had 6 overseas offices, 3 in North America, 3 in Europe. Now jumping down to the present, there's 20 overseas offices, of which 9 are in the Asia-Pacific region, 6 in the States, 4 in Europe, and 1 in Sao Paulo. So that's an interesting way of looking at the shifting power relations in the world, and where, of course, new multinationals are. We've heard this morning, of course, about the growth of southern or eastern multinationals, whatever way you want to put it. That clearly Asia is going to be the springboard from which many of the global multinationals of the future are emerging. So it's very important for the IDA to be in there, and it is in there. But of course, it's very much more difficult for Ireland to be attracting Asian multinationals compared to the US multinationals for all sorts of reasons. There's the common language and so on, also the common legal system that we share with the US, and heritage factors and so on. The FDI policy ecosystem, it's very interesting to trace out how it has impacted on the structure of the Irish economy over time. I've spent a lot of time looking at this. It has its place in the bureaucracy has been such that it has played an important role in areas that you typically don't associate as being within the industrial promotion remit. So the development of physical infrastructure, the development of the telecommunications system in Ireland really consisted of the IDA doing battle with the old moribund Department of Posts and Telegraphs, and eventually wresting control of the telecommunications system out of the hands of the government department. It's had an impact on human capital upgrading. It's strongly influenced science, technology, and innovation policy, and so on. So the the IDA and its sister agencies are hugely important. I want to make a couple of points about the impact of globalization on FDI globally and in Ireland. The single European market, what we used to call the 1992 process, as Darius and I discussed earlier on there, was very, very important. It levelled the playing field. What we found essentially post hoc was that some of the large European countries have been flexing their muscles with respect to large corporations, saying if you don't come and locate in our country, be it France or the UK or Germany, our healthcare system will not be buying your pharmaceuticals, or our civil service will not be buying your computer systems, and so on. Those kind of restrictive public procurement policies were outlawed under the Single European Act, and that proved very beneficial for Ireland. Philip showed the inside of a mobile phone earlier on, showing where the bits and pieces all come from, and so on. That's clearly influenced the nature of FDI substantially in recent decades. Services now comprise, of course, a particularly high share of Irish exports. And just doing these slides last night, I thought that's probably a reflection of Ireland's position as an advanced periphery. The periphery meaning transport costs as an Ireland economy. It's difficult to, Edgar made this point earlier on, it's difficult or expensive to shift goods out of Ireland to the centre of Europe. That would be my concept, I suppose, the geographer's concept of peripherality. But as an advanced periphery, you get a lot of high-value services being produced and exported from here. So I'm going to largely skip what I was going to say about developments across some key sectors here, because much of this has been said already. Just to make a couple of points. So I'm the economist, so we think often, or we tend to think in terms of comparative advantage. So revealed comparative advantage is a way of actually matching data to the theory that we subscribe to. computer hardware. Back, in the 1990s, Ireland had a strong revealed comparative advantage in computer hardware. That's gone now. Dell was the last big company, well, Intel, but that's in a different sector. Dell was the last company remaining in Ireland that assembled computers here. So our comparative advantage is no longer in computer hardware, but we have a strong revealed comparative advantage in software and IT services, international financial services, and clearly pharmaceuticals and medical devices. Just to make the point that Chris and I, well, building on work that Chris had done with David Jacobson, that I had done with Declan Curran, and so on, Chris and I put a paper together a couple of years ago, tracing the evolution within ICT, Ireland's evolution out of hardware and into software and IT services. And one of the fascinating things you see is that all the big hardware companies really stayed in Ireland. They no longer do their hardware production here, but they do a lot of the high-value IT services exports out of Ireland. So Apple, Digital, Dell, IBM are all still here. Dell shocked the country really a couple of years ago by moving its hardware production out of Ireland, initially to Poland and the Far East, but it retained its high-value services functions here. What we see with a company like Apple is that when it stopped hardware production in Ireland, its workforce went way down, of course. Just Dell's workforce fell by 50% when it shifted hardware production, but Apple has recovered its employment, as have the other former hardware producing firms. So the fact that they stayed here in Ireland but shifted out of hardware and into software and IT services, is an indication of the resilience of the Irish economy. Pharmaceuticals, we've said enough about already. This is a conclusion that Chris and I arrived at in a paper a couple of years ago. Just that the Irish pharmaceutical sector, rather the multinational pharmaceutical sector in Ireland, has upgraded over time. And of course it's clearly one of our strongest sectors now, as I'll show you when I come to look at the export data in a moment. Medical devices is another strong multinational dominated sector. And Darius has told us a lot about international financial services. I'm glad to see his data matches mine by and large. That's the makeup. There's one point that I wanted to say though. So within banking and capital markets, a lot of the securitization used to be done in the IFSC. The securitization that blew up the world economy. A lot of that had been done in the IFSC. That has clearly, reduced substantially those activities. But it's been offset to some extent by a big expansion in aircraft leasing, for which the IFSC is the world's leading centre. Interestingly, aircraft leasing is counter-cyclical. It's the kind of sector that's nice to have, because when the world economy goes into recession, airlines stop buying aircraft, they start leasing them. So that has buoyed up the banking and capital market segment. Of the three segments here, the investment management segment is, investment management has increased its employment, but more recently, the insurance segment has done quite well. And this is quite interesting. It didn't arise in Darius's talk, but I can track quite a lot on US corporation tax developments. So I mentioned there when President Obama was running for the Democratic nomination, he made noises that sounded very threatening to Ireland. When he got into power, all actually that did take place was that the US administration announced a tightening of regulations on US investments in Caribbean jurisdictions. And the Caribbean jurisdictions tend to be the centre of a particular element in the value chain of the global insurance industry. And a lot of that industry has moved out of the Caribbean and into Ireland. So that's quite interesting, that corporation tax changes on the part of government are very difficult to read in advance. Another thing that has worked to Ireland's benefit was that the G20's targeting on locations that operate bank secrecy. So Ireland is not regarded as a location that operates banking secrecy laws. Other EU countries are, and are put on a grey list, and that acted to the benefit of the IFSC. So there's these sorts of interesting developments that take place in the background. Initially, when the crisis started, there was a discussion about how foreign direct investment flows worldwide were collapsing, and that looked pretty dangerous to Ireland. But in fact, Ireland booked the trend in terms of FDI inflows. But in fact, if you spend a bit of time working on these things, you realise that the flow data are actually not very important. They're very, very loosely related to the real activity data of multinational companies that we prefer to focus on, that is employment, production, exports, and so on. Export volumes, just to show you, so 2007 was a final year before before exports globally started to deteriorate and so on. The EU15 represents the Western European EU. These are the most latest data for 2011. We see Ireland, the column on the left. Ireland has done better on average with respect to exports than the EU15, and that is largely accounted for by the strong share of services in Irish exports, which again I'm reading as an indication of an advanced peripheral economy. So our services exports have remained relatively buoyant. Couple more slides. This one, what sectors have contributed to manufacturing export growth? You see the black line there is manufacturing export growth. It fell below zero in 2008, 2009, meaning manufacturing exports declined in those years. The thing to notice here is the pharma, that's the blue box. So the pharma exports have largely propped up our manufacturing exports. They're quite resilient in a recession, but when the world comes out of a recession, they don't jump up that much. They're not very cyclical. So they're almost play a counter-cyclical role. It's quite a good sector to have because of this counter-cyclical role that it plays. The world economy goes into recession, people still buy their pharmaceuticals. So pharma is a good sector for us to have a real comparative advantage in. This reflects services exports growth. Computer services, the second last box here, have been quite resilient. Interestingly, in 2009, which was the 1 year when services exports out of Ireland fell, the one sector that prospered was indigenous software exports. Sean Renehan has written a lot on indigenous software. It's a fascinating sector. Indigenous software exports were quite buoyant. Multinational software exports out of Ireland declined in that year, so that's quite interesting. FDI prospects. To me, the main threats on the horizon are to do with the corporation tax regime. There's a lot of there's competitiveness gains in the Irish economy that will stand to our export sectors when the world economy turns around. Competitiveness gains are likely to prove a greater stimulus to indigenous exports than to the foreign sector. Crunchy has made the point earlier on today. You know, the foreign sector, foreign companies come here because they're highly profitable to reap the benefits of the corporation tax regime. So labour costs and that don't matter much to them. Labour costs matter a lot more to indigenous exports, and that's a positive sign. And I'm basically on my last couple of slides, so I will point one thing here: linkages and productivity spillovers. This is something that is of interest to the audience here, since there's a number of papers on this. There's a couple of papers. Chris van Egeraat has a recent paper on clustering in the pharmaceutical sector. Magella Giblin and Paul Ryan have a paper on clustering in medical devices. And as I say, drawing on Sean Renehan's work and others, I have a paper on clustering in the indigenous software sector, the emergence of the indigenous software sector. And what we see is that really these reflect different kinds of externalities. In pharmaceuticals and in medical devices, you have intra-industry externalities, that is, externalities that are arising from multinational firms within the same industry. The growth of the indigenous software sector arose to the extent that it arose because of externalities. It arose because of the externalities of having a broad diversity of foreign multinational firms in Ireland. That was a key trigger to the growth of the indigenous software industry, as well as various governmental policies that were in place that were designed to increase the attractiveness of the economy to foreign direct investment, but that had the unanticipated effect of providing an environment within which indigenous software would emerge as, basically Ireland's key indigenous high-tech sector. And then the final slide, and this is something that, has not, I think, been picked up on by anybody as yet, but it's quite interesting. We know that indigenous firms purchase a lot of their raw materials in Ireland. Foreign firms don't. Foreign firms purchase a lot of their services in Ireland, and services purchases are very labour intensive. Basically, if you purchase services, you're paying for jobs. That's what services are. The bulk of Irish services purchases are made by the foreign affiliate services segment, which is a big growing segment in the multinational sector. And that's the thing I show on the final slide here. Just to show you, raw materials purchased in Ireland, indigenous firms purchase 8.5 billion, foreign firms 2.5 billion. But look at services purchased in Ireland, indigenous firms purchase 4 billion, foreign firms purchase 9 billion, and the vast bulk of these are purchased by foreign services companies buying indigenous services. And so when we talk about the prospects for export-led growth, we know that the major sector of the economy that will be expanding into export markets and drawing in FDI is foreign affiliate services. And their backward linkages to the rest of the economy are very employment intensive. So that's a cause for optimism. And I suppose there's no harm in ending my talk on a cause for optimism, a note of optimism. Thanks.